Welcome to the third part of our look at America during the Cold War. We've looked at the containment policy embraced by the United States in places like Greece, Turkey, and Korea, and considered different ways the Soviet Union and the United States faced off during the Cold War, like supplying the enemies of each other with support and the race to secure the most nuclear weapons. Today we'll look at another Cold War battlefield, space, and a major failing in the containment policy in the little nation of Vietnam. It's Cold War Part 3. Space offered another avenue for the United States and Soviet Union to battle. The Soviet Union struck the first blow in 1957 when they launched Sputnik into space. Sputnik was the first satellite to be launched into orbit, and American attempts had previously failed. Many believed that the Soviet Union had surpassed the Americans with regards to technology, with many blaming schools for inadequately teaching children science. In response, Congress passed the National Defense Education Act in 1958, which gave hundreds of millions of dollars for the teaching of science. That same year, Congress created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, better known as NASA, and the United States launched its own satellites into orbit later that year in 1958. But the Soviets struck again in 1961 after Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. Weeks later, American Alan Shepard would be the second man to travel into space. With the United States clearly losing the race to space, President Kennedy in 1962 proclaimed, "No nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." And while JFK would not be alive to see it, the United States would win the space race on July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. And the famous line, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." Indochina had been a French colony since the 1880s, and during World War II, it was taken over by the Japanese. But when Japan was forced to surrender, France wanted to regain control of its colony, but it met resistance from Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist who sought independence for Vietnam, which was part of the Indochina Peninsula. After France was defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, France was forced out. This caused a problem for the United States because the United States would not allow Vietnam to become a communist country under Ho Chi Minh. And it is here in Vietnam that the United States would spend the next 21 years battling for control. So the United States wanted to play a role in shaping what happened in Vietnam after the French left at the Geneva Convention because of the domino theory, which was the American idea that stated that if one country fell to communism, the others around it would soon follow. The picture demonstrates this. If Vietnam were to fall, so would Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand, and soon all of Asia would be communist. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with a communist north controlled by Ho Chi Minh and a non-communist south under the influence of the United States. There would be elections to reunite the country, but when it became clear that Ho Chi Minh would win this election, the South backed out. And when they backed out of the elections, the North then attacked the South. Eisenhower had sent military advisors to Vietnam in the 1950s, and this was significantly increased by Kennedy with more than 15,000 military personnel in Vietnam in the early 1960s. Kennedy would not get to see what happened next, as on November 22nd, 1963, the president was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, making John F. Kennedy the fourth and final U.S. president to be assassinated. 2 days later, Americans watched the assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, killed on national television by Jack Ruby. Lyndon Johnson would be sworn in as the next president of the United States. The assassination of Kennedy has led to many conspiracy theories. While the Warren Commission said that Oswald acted alone, some have said organized crime, Castro, the CIA, the FBI, among many others, were involved in the death of the president. All I can say is that this is a very interesting topic to look into. Johnson was then responsible for the developing conflict in Vietnam. Johnson believed that the United States was obligated to prevent communism from spreading into South Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 gave Johnson the opportunity to send American troops into Vietnam. Allegedly, American ships in the Gulf of Tonkin were fired on by North Vietnamese gunboats. Johnson used this claim, for which there was very little evidence, to persuade Congress that the United States needed to send troops into Vietnam. This would lead to the start of the Vietnam War, which until our current wars in Iraq and Afghanistan would be the longest war in American history. And Johnson would steadily increase the number of American troops in Vietnam between 1965 and 1968. There would be 184,000 troops in Vietnam at the end of 1965, and in March 1969 there would be 540,000 troops in Southeast Asia attempting to stop the spread of communism in the little country of Vietnam. The limited war in Vietnam would be frustrated for American forces. When they could find the North Vietnamese, the United States could defeat them. But this was not easy to accomplish. The terrain was tough, the tropical climate, the jungle, the fact that the North Vietnamese knew the terrain. If the Americans would bomb a bridge and then 2 days later a new bridge would pop up, there was a tunnel system in North Vietnam. The United States could not locate the enemy and destroy them. Oftentimes, the enemy did not wear uniforms, so it was difficult to know who they were fighting. American search and destroy missions resulted in the destruction of several Vietnamese hamlets while searching for the enemy, and many atrocities committed against people of North Vietnam. There was a serious divide at home when it came to the Vietnam War. Hawks were those who supported the war because it was necessary in the effort to contain communism. Hawks tended to be older Americans, many who fought in World War II, along with most of the government. Doves were those who were opposed to the war, as they believed it was an unjust war and it was something that the United States should not be involved in. This group consisted of the youth, college students, civil rights activists, hippies, and feminists. College campuses provided the backdrop for much anti-war activity. Some were peaceful, some led massive rallies that occupied buildings, all in the name of protesting the Vietnam War. And in other college campuses, there was violence. And again, this was all in opposition to a war that the youth believed was unjust. The most infamous incident of the anti-war movement took place at Kent State University in Ohio, when Ohio National Guardsmen opened fire on unarmed college students after conflict between the two sides. At the end, 4 students lay dead and another 9 were wounded from protesting a war a half a world away. There you see the iconic image from that day. Back in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese launched a coordinated surprise attack on 100 areas in South Vietnam, including American bases, on the Vietnamese New Year of Tet. The United States counterattacked and exacted 10 times as many casualties on North Vietnamese forces than American forces took, and they also recovered any territory that was taken by the North Vietnamese. But at home, this was viewed as a defeat, as Americans could see the destruction on TV and could see the Americans struggling through the Tet Offensive. It was also clear that the United States had not, in fact, turned the corner in the war as General Westmoreland had claimed late in 1967. Lyndon Johnson's presidency would be another casualty of the Tet Offensive. Johnson went on television and announced that the United States would start negotiating a peace with North Vietnam. And he also said that he would not accept the Democratic Party's nomination for president in 1968. This is not a decision that most politicians would make. But the picture here captures Johnson's spirit in 1968. The war had defeated him. In 1968, Republican Richard Nixon, who had served as vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, defeated Democrat Eugene McCarthy, and Nixon would inherit the quagmire in Vietnam. Under Nixon, the United States would start the process of drawing down its forces in Vietnam. This process was known as Vietnamization. Vietnamization was where the United States would pull its troops out, but train and supply the South Vietnamese forces that would take its place fighting the North Vietnamese. This was the beginning of the end of the American involvement in Vietnam, but it would take several more years for the final exit. The United States launched a massive bombing campaign on North Vietnam in December 1972. All told, the United States dropped 100,000 bombs on major North Vietnamese cities like Hanoi and Haiphong. The impact of this was eventually it got the North Vietnamese to come back to the table and negotiate. And in the agreement reached in Paris in January 1973, the United States agreed to pull its troops out of Vietnam. It would get 500 prisoners of war back. Among these prisoners of war was the individual who had come to be the Arizona Senator, John McCain. There would be a ceasefire and free elections. But at the time of the ceasefire, there were still tens of thousands of North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in May 1973, but there was a civil war continuing in Vietnam. The picture there shows the last Americans leaving Vietnam as North Vietnamese forces prepared to overrun Saigon. These Americans were evacuating the American embassy by helicopter in 1975. And once Saigon fell in April 1975, Vietnam would be united as a communist country. This makes the Vietnam War a failure in the containment policy. And let's close the show by considering the impact of the Vietnam War. 58,000 Americans died and another 300,000 were wounded in a war that many of those who served did not understand. Many came home and joined the anti-war movement. These vets were not celebrated. There were no parades for them upon their return from Southeast Asia. Many faced outright open hostility from the American people for taking part in a war that the American people did not like. It would take several years before the service of these veterans would be recognized and honored. The Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., which opened in 1982, serves as a reminder of this service. We'll close out the Cold War next time with the Cold War at home, Ronald Reagan, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Until then, good night, Albuquerque.